Welcome, dear viewers, to a story that transcends time. Today I bring you a narrative that will transport us to the year 1852, to an era where true love had to face the inflexible walls of social differences. This is the story of Catalina and Alfonso, two souls destined to meet, but separated by an abyss of prejudices and conventions. A young maid with a noble heart and a count tormented by his past will discover that the purest love can flourish in the most unexpected places. Between silent gardens, libraries perfumed with secrets, and salons where appearances reign, Catalina and Alfonso will write a story that challenges everything that is established. Before we begin, I would love to get to know you better. Where are you joining us from today? From what corner of the world do you share this moment with me? If this story manages to touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like so that more people can discover these narratives that remind us of the beauty of true love. Year 1852. Mendoza Mansion, province of Valladolid, Spain. The October rain beat against the mansion's windows like desperate tears, and in each drop seemed to resonate the beating of a heart preparing to change forever. The carriage stopped before the imposing entrance, its wheels sinking into the mud that the storm had converted into a mirror of grey skies. Catalina Morales descended with the dignity that only those possess who have learned to keep their heads high when the world conspires to humiliate them. Her 19 years carried the weight of others' sacrifices of debts she had not contracted, but which she now had to pay with her freedom. The humid wind played with the rebellious locks that escaped from her modest hairstyle, as if nature itself wanted to free her from the bonds that brought her to this place. The main door opened with the majesty of a cathedral, revealing Doña Mercedes, the governess, whose face seemed carved in marble by years of severity and well-guarded secrets. Her eyes, the color of tempered steel, examined Catalina from head to toe, with the precision of a judge who had already passed sentence. "You must be Catalina Morales," she pronounced each syllable as if it were a lesson that should remain engraved in the air. "In this house, girl, there is no place for sentimentality or weakness. Count Alfonso de Mendoza expects perfection from those who serve under his roof." The mansion's interior stretched like a labyrinth of cold marble and tapestries that whispered stories of past glories. The chandeliers projected dancing shadows that seemed to warn Catalina about the mysteries that dwelt between these walls. Her footsteps echoed in the corridors like echoes of a previous life, of the freedom she had just left behind. The room assigned to her was small and gloomy, located in the rear wing of the mansion, where the servants lived away from the magnificence reserved for nobility. The tiny window allowed the passage of a deathly light that barely managed to illuminate the narrow bed and the worn wooden wardrobe. However, in this simplicity, Catalina found something that the golden salons could not offer her: privacy for her thoughts and refuge for her unshed tears. On that first night, while listening to the wind moan through the garden branches, Catalina made a silent oath that was engraved in her soul like a sacred promise she would survive this trial, keep her dignity intact, and never allow circumstances to bend the spirit that burned within her like an inextinguishable flame. Rumors ran through the corridors like rats in the darkness, whispering about the Count's imminent return, about the tragedy that had brought mourning to the mansion, and about the secrets that dwelt in every corner of this house that seemed to live in perpetual mourning. But Catalina, with the premature wisdom of one who had known pain, intuited that her arrival at the Mendoza mansion was not mere chance of destiny. What hidden forces had conspired to bring her to this place, where past and present intertwined, like threads of an unfinished tapestry? The first encounter. Dawn arrived at the Mendoza mansion, wrapped in a mist that transformed the gardens into dreamlike landscapes, where reality and fantasy blurred like watercolors under rain. Catalina awakened with the first song of the crickets that dwelt among the rose bushes, and sat up with the natural grace of one who finds beauty even in the most difficult moments. The kitchen was the beating heart of the mansion, a place where the aromas of cinnamon and freshly baked bread mixed with the whispers and confidences of the servants. Maria, the cook, a woman whose hands seemed blessed to create culinary miracles, received Catalina with a smile that illuminated the environment like the sun after clouds. "The Count returns today from his trip to Madrid," murmured Isabel, the youngest, made while her eyes shone with a mixture of emotion and fear. "They say that since the death of Countess Elena, Don Alfonso has become a man of ice, distant like the mountains in winter." The rumors floated in the air like incense, creating a dense atmosphere of mystery and expectation. They spoke of a 32-year-old man who had known the glory of love and the devastation of loss, of someone who walked through the halls of his own house like a ghost in search of redemption. When the noon bells resonated over the mansion, the echo of horse hooves announced the return of the lord of the house. Catalina, who at that moment was polishing the crystals of the great hall, felt how the very air seemed to change, becoming denser, more charged with an energy she could not explain. Alfonso de Mendoza entered his mansion with the presence of one born to command, but in his grey eyes the colour of autumn storms. Catalina perceived a deep sadness that contrasted with the firmness of his bearing. His dark brown hair framed a face that pain had chiseled with premature lines, converting it into a map of silent sufferings. Their gazes crossed for an instant that stretched like eternity, and in that fleeting encounter, something indefinable vibrated in the air between them. The Count's eyes examined her with an intensity that made Catalina feel as if he could read each of her thoughts, each of her secrets. "Who is she?" asked Alfonso to Doña Mercedes without taking his eyes off Catalina. "The new maid, my lord. Catalina Morales. She arrived yesterday to supply the needs of domestic service." The Count nodded slowly, but in his eyes remained that spark of curiosity that had awakened upon seeing the young woman. Catalina made a perfect curtsy, maintaining the composure she had learned to preserve like a treasure. But when she straightened and their gazes met again, she felt that something fundamental had changed in the air she breathed. That night, while the servants shared stories by the kitchen fire, Catalina heard tales about the late Countess Elena, a woman of legendary beauty who had filled the mansion with laughter and light during the few years of her marriage. Her premature death had plunged the Count into a mourning that seemed to have no end, converting him into a man who inhabited his own house like a stranger. But there was something in the way Alfonso had looked at her, something that awakened, in Catalina, a sweet and dangerous restlessness like the aroma of flowers that bloom only once before withering. Could a simple maid awaken emotions in a heart that believed it had buried forever all its feelings? The nocturnal encounter night enveloped the Mendoza mansion like a cloak of black velvet, and in that darkness, perfumed by the jasmine that climbed through the windows, Catalina discovered that the silence of dawn possessed its own music. Restless from the thoughts that danced in her mind like nocturnal butterflies, she decided to explore the corridors that during the day remained forbidden to someone of her condition. Her bare feet whispered over the cold marble as she advanced, through the shadows guided by the silvery light of the moon that filtered through the stained glass. The portraits of illustrious ancestors watched her from their golden frames like silent guardians of secrets that time had converted into legends. It was in the corridor leading to the library where she encountered him. Alfonso emerged from the shadows like an apparition wrapped in a dark silk robe that accentuated the aristocratic pallor of his skin. His grey eyes found her in the penumbra, with the precision of one who knows every corner of his home, and for a moment that stretched like a century, they remained motionless, studying each other in the complicit silence of night. "What is a young maid doing wandering the mansion corridors at these hours?" His voice was grave, modulated by years of refined education, but in it there was a genuine curiosity that contrasted with the coldness he had shown during the day. Catalina felt how blush ignited her cheeks, but maintained the composure she had learned to value as her most precious possession. "Forgive me, my lord. I could not find sleep, and thought that a brief walk might calm my thoughts. It was not my intention to disturb your rest." Alfonso approached one step, and in the proximity Catalina could perceive the subtle aroma of his cologne mixed with the masculine perfume of his skin. It was a fragrance that spoke of old books, fine leather, and secrets kept in drawers locked with keys. "Restless thoughts are frequent companions in this house," he murmured, and in his voice there was a tinge of melancholy that touched something deep in Catalina's heart. These walls have been witnesses to many sleepless nights, to many souls seeking peace in darkness. The moonlight created a silvery halo around both of them, as if night itself had decided to bless this fortuitous encounter. Alfonso extended his hand, indicating a window that opened to the gardens. "Do you see that rose bush that grows by the lake?" he asked with a softness that contrasted with the authority he had shown hours before. "My wife planted it during our first year of marriage. She said that the most beautiful roses bloom in darkness, feeding on the moon and the secrets that night keeps." Catalina followed the direction of his gaze and contemplated the garden bathed in an ethereal light that transformed each bush, each pathway into a fairy tale setting. The rose bush to which the Count referred rose majestically by the lake, its white flowers shining like stars fallen from the sky. "She was very wise, your wife," responded Catalina with sincerity, feeling how the words sprang from her heart without filters or calculations. Alfonso looked at her with renewed intensity, as if he had discovered something unexpected in that simple observation. Yes, she was. She had the capacity to find beauty where others only saw darkness. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but full of a tacit understanding that neither dared to name. In those moments shared in the penumbra, something, invisible but tangible, began to weave between them like the first threads of a tapestry that promised to become a masterpiece. "You should return to your room, Miss Morales," Alfonso finally said, but in his voice there was no reproach but a sweet concern. "A lady should not walk alone through these corridors during the night." The word lady resonated in Catalina's ears, like an unexpected caress. In that moment she knew that something had changed irrevocably between them, as if the night had been witness to the birth of a connection that would challenge all social conventions. Could destiny have conspired to unite two souls in an apparently casual encounter under the moonlight, Silra? The accident in the woods. Autumn painted the mansion gardens with golden and copper brushstrokes, transforming each leaf into a small work of art that the wind swayed like pages of a poetry book. Catalina had developed the habit of rising before dawn to contemplate how the first light of day slowly awakened the sleeping beauty of the landscape. Since her nocturnal encounter with the Count, something had changed in the mansion's atmosphere. Their gazes crossed more frequently during daily tasks, and in each visual exchange, there was a silent conversation that neither dared to translate into words. That morning, as she headed to the stable to feed the doves that nested in the bell, Tower Catalina heard the accelerated gallop of a horse approaching through the forest trail. It was a desperate, irregular sound, very different from the measured and elegant rhythm that characterized the Count's morning rides. Alfonso's mare appeared among the trees without a rider, her eyes widened by panic and her dark coat glistening with sweat. Catalina's heart contracted into a fist of anguish, and without thinking twice, she followed the tracks that the hooves had left engraved in the moist earth of the trail. She found him in a clearing where the sun's rays filtered through the oak, treetops like fingers of golden light. Alfonso lay beside a fallen trunk, conscious, but clearly in pain, his face contracted in a grimace he could not disguise. His white shirt was torn and stained with earth, and a wound on his forehead let escape a thread of blood that contrasted dramatically with the pallor of his skin. "My lord," murmured Catalina, kneeling beside him with a naturalness that surprised even herself. "Can you move? Do you feel pain anywhere specific?" Alfonso looked at her with eyes that surprise had made vulnerable, stripped of the mask of aristocratic composure he habitually wore. In that vulnerability, Catalina discovered the profound humanity that hid behind the refined manners and natural authority of the nobleman. "I believe my ankle is twisted," he admitted with a smile that tried to diminish the importance of the accident. "And my pride definitely wounded. It's not the most dignified image for a Count of Mendoza, is it?" Catalina's hands, educated by years of caring for her family and helping the needy in her hometown, examined the wound with a delicacy that contrasted with the efficiency of her movements. She tore a piece of her petticoat to improvise a bandage, and while cleaning the blood from Alfonso's forehead, she felt how he observed each of her gestures with an attention that went beyond gratitude. "You have the hands of a healer," he commented, with a voice that pain had made graver, more intimate. "Where did you learn to care for wounds with such skill?" "In my town, my lord. When one is poor, one learns to be doctor, nurse, and apothecary at the same time. Necessity teaches more than all. The books in the world." Alfonso tried to sit up and groaned slightly when the weight fell on his injured ankle. Without hesitating, Catalina placed herself under his arm, offering him her shoulder as support. The contact awakened in both an acute awareness of the proximity of their bodies, of the heat that emanated from each other's skin, of the unexpected intimacy that the accident had created between them. The path back to the mansion became a slow and careful dance, where each step required coordination and mutual trust. Alfonso leaned on Catalina with a naturalness that spoke of a deeper connection than circumstances, and she sustained him with a strength that surprised them both. "Why do you help me?" asked Alfonso when they were halfway, stopping under the protective shade of a centennial chestnut tree. "I am your employer, not your friend. Social conventions do not oblige you to show such solicitude for my well-being." Catalina looked at him with eyes that shone with crystalline honesty, and in that gaze Alfonso found an answer that words could not have expressed with such eloquence. "Because you are wounded, my lord, and before pain there are no differences of class or birth. There is only a human being who needs help and another who can offer it." In that moment, under the filtered light of the autumn woods, with the aroma of fallen leaves mixing with Catalina's subtle perfume, Alfonso de Mendoza knew he had found something he believed lost forever, the capacity to feel that his heart could still beat for another human being. Could a simple lesson in humanity awaken emotions he had believed buried forever under the weight of mourning and loneliness? Revelations in the library. The days following the accident passed with a sweet slowness that seemed to have been infected by the measured rhythm with which Alfonso recovered from his wounds. Catalina had assumed the unofficial responsibility of caring for his bandages and supervising his progress, a task she fulfilled with a dedication that did not go unnoticed by the other servants or by the Count himself. The mansion's library had become Alfonso's preferred refuge during his convalescence. It was a magnificent room, with shelves that rose to the vaulted ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes that held centuries of wisdom. The windows offered a privileged view of the gardens, and the golden light of autumn afternoons filtered through the velvet curtains, creating an atmosphere of scholarly intimacy. It was there where Catalina found him one afternoon, not reading as she expected, but contemplating fixedly a portrait that hung over the marble fireplace. The painting showed a woman of ethereal beauty, with blonde hair that fell in soft waves over her shoulders and blue eyes that seemed to guard secrets of happiness. Her smile was radiant, full of a joy of living that contrasted painfully with the melancholy that now inhabited that room. "It's her, isn't it?" asked Catalina, softly approaching until she stood beside Alfonso. "Countess Elena." Alfonso nodded slowly, without taking his eyes from the portrait that seemed to exercise a hypnotic fascination over him. "It was painted during our first year of marriage," he murmured with a voice that memory had made tender. "Elena was 23 years old and had just discovered she was expecting our first child. I had never seen her so radiant, so full of hope and happiness." The revelation fell upon Catalina like cold drizzle. She had not known that the Countess had been pregnant when she died, and this information added an additional tragic dimension to the loss that had devastated Alfonso. "What happened?" she asked, with the delicacy of one who knows that some wounds never finish healing completely. Alfonso turned to her, and in his grey eyes Catalina could read a deep guilt that had been corroding his soul like a silent acid. "It was my fault," he confessed with brutal honesty. "Elena begged me not to travel to Madrid that autumn. She was in her 6th month of pregnancy and felt weak, but I insisted. There were urgent financial matters to resolve, social commitments to fulfill. I put my obligations as a nobleman before my responsibilities as a husband." His hands closed into tight fists, as if trying to contain an emotion that threatened to overflow him. The carriage overturned in a ravine near Avila. Elena survived 3 days, but the baby, our son, was lost immediately. She died whispering my name, asking forgiveness for not being strong enough to give me the heir I expected. The tears that Alfonso had contained during years of solitary mourning began to slide down his cheeks like drops of distilled pain. Catalina felt how her own heart contracted with compassion, and without thinking she extended her hand to touch his gently. "It was not your fault, my lord," she murmured with a conviction that was born from the depths of her soul. "Accidents happen, and true love knows no guilt or reproach. I am sure that Countess Eleanor loved you too much to blame you for something. That was beyond your control." Alfonso looked at her with surprise, as if Catalina's words had touched a sensitive chord that had remained mute for a long time. "How can you be so sure you didn't know her?" "Because I know your heart, my lord," responded Catalina, with a simplicity that contained all the wisdom of the world. "And a heart like yours capable of loving so deeply that the pain of loss consumes, it could only have been corresponded by an equally pure and generous love." In the golden penumbra of the library, surrounded by the complicit silence of thousands of books that had been witnesses to other stories of love and loss, Alfonso felt that Catalina's words began to heal wounds. He had believed incurable. For the first time in 3 years, he could remember Elena without the memory causing him piercing pain, but a sweet melancholy that spoke of eternal love, but also of the possibility of finding happiness again. "Thank you," he whispered. And in that simple word there was a universe of gratitude that went far beyond thanks for the physical cures she had provided him. Could the balm of understanding and compassion begin to heal the wounds of the soul that time had been unable to heal? The confession. Under the moon. Midnight had transformed the library into a sanctuary of shadows and whispers where the golden spines of books shone like distant stars under the silvery light of the full moon. Alfonso had developed the habit of taking refuge there during the most silent hours of the night, when the weight of memories became more tolerable in the company of the great thinkers who inhabited those pages. He did not expect to find Catalina there standing before the windows contemplating the gardens, bathed in that ethereal light that converted the familiar landscape into something magical and unreal. She wore a simple white cotton robe that the moonlight made diaphanous, and her loose hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders like a cascade of brown silk. "I could not sleep," she murmured, without turning as if she had intuited his presence before he spoke a word. There are nights when thoughts become too noisy to allow rest. Alfonso approached until he stood beside her, and in the proximity he could perceive the subtle aroma of her skin, a fragrance that spoke of lavender soap and something indefinably feminine that awakened in him sensations he had believed dormant forever. "What does a young woman like you think about during these sleepless nights?" he asked with a genuine curiosity that went beyond superficial courtesy. Catalina turned to him, and the moonlight illuminated her face with a softness that enhanced the natural beauty of her features. In her dark eyes, Alfonso could read an emotional depth that contrasted with the simplicity of her social condition. "I think about the paths that brought us here," she responded with an honesty that surprised him with its vulnerability. "About the decisions we make and those that others make for us. About how sometimes destiny places us exactly where we need to be, although we don't understand it at the moment." Her words floated in the air like petals of a nocturnal flower, charged with meanings that neither dared to explore completely. Alfonso felt how something moved in his chest, a sensation he had not experienced since the happy days with Elena, but different, more intense, more urgent. "Catalina," he murmured her name like a prayer, and upon pronouncing it he knew he had crossed an invisible line that separated the courtesy of an employer from something much more dangerous and beautiful. She looked at him with eyes that shone like stars, and in that gaze Alfonso found an answer to questions he had not dared to formulate, even in the privacy of his most secret thoughts. "My lord," she whispered, but in her voice there was not the formality of servitude, but the intimate softness of a woman who recognizes the awakening of profound emotions. Alfonso extended his hand, and with the delicacy of one who touches something sacred, he gently caressed Catalina's cheek. Her skin was soft as velvet, warm as the light of home, and under his fingers he could feel the almost imperceptible tremor that revealed the perturbation his caresses awakened in her. "I should not feel this," he confessed, with an honesty that left him vulnerable before her. "I should not look at you and see not an employee, but the most beautiful woman my eyes have contemplated. I should not hear your voice and feel that my heart beats again with an intensity I believed lost forever." Catalina's eyes filled with tears that the moon transformed into diamonds, and when she spoke, her voice trembled with the emotion of one who recognizes a truth that terrifies and exalts her at the same time. "And I should not wake each morning, hoping for the moment when our gazes meet. I should not feel that each conversation with you is like fresh water for a thirsty soul. I should not love you with an intensity that defies everything I was taught about class differences and the impossibilities of the heart." The mutual confession floated between them like an invisible bridge that united and separated them at the same time. Alfonso felt how his heart expanded, with a happiness he had not experienced in years, but also with the acute pain of knowing that this love, however genuine, faced obstacles that seemed insurmountable. "What shall we do?" he murmured, and in his question was all the anguish of a man divided between duty and heart. Catalina approached one step closer until the distance between them was reduced to a sigh. Her hand rose to touch Alfonso's face with the same delicacy with which he had caressed hers. "I don't know," she admitted with lacerating sincerity. "I only know that in this moment, under this moon, that has been witness to 1,000 impossible loves, I am completely yours, and you are completely mine." Alfonso took her in his arms with a reverence that spoke of adoration, more than passion, and when their lips met in a kiss that sealed their mutual confession, time stopped as if the universe itself had decided to bless this moment of pure and true love. But even while they lost themselves in the sweetness of that first kiss, both knew they had crossed a line that would change their lives forever. Could true love find a way when the entire world conspired to separate the lovers? Was the arrival of the rival. The four-horse carriage approached the Mendoza mansion with a pomp that made all the servants discreetly peer out the windows. It was a splendid vehicle decorated with heraldic coats of arms that spoke of lineage and wealth, pulled by thoroughbred steeds that gleamed under the autumn sun like bronze statues in movement. Catalina observed from the kitchen window as a woman descended from the carriage, who seemed to have been sculpted by the gods as an example of aristocratic perfection. Constanza de Herrera was an impressive beauty with blonde hair like spun gold and blue eyes that shone with the coldness of diamonds. Her traveling dress, made of navy blue velvet with Belgian lace adornments, spoke of refined taste and considerable financial resources. "She's the Count's betrothed," murmured Isabel beside Catalina, with a mixture of admiration and apprehension in her voice. "Doña Constanza de Herrera, from the family of the Dukes of Albuquerque. They say the engagement was arranged by the families when both were children." Catalina's heart contracted, as if an invisible hand had squeezed it forcefully. During the weeks that had followed their nocturnal confession in the library, she had lived in a bubble of clandestine happiness, feeding on furtive glances and whispered conversations that filled her soul with golden light. But Constanza's arrival was like a bell announcing the end of a beautiful dream. Doña Mercedes appeared in the kitchen with her most severe expression, distributing orders with the military efficiency that characterized her. "Miss de Herrera will stay in the blue suite of the East Wing. I want everything to be impeccable, fresh flowers in all vases, French linen sheets, and the Sèvres porcelain dinnerware perfectly polished. This visit will determine the future of the Mendoza family." Catalina was assigned to the direct service of the distinguished guest, a responsibility that would have been an honor in other circumstances, but which now felt like exquisite torture. While preparing the room with the meticulousness that characterized all her work, she could not avoid imagining this beautiful woman sharing not only Alfonso's home, but also his heart and his future. Constanza made her entrance into the mansion, with the natural grace of one born to inhabit palaces. Her beauty was indisputable, but there was something in her blue eyes that Catalina found disturbing, a calculating coldness that contrasted with the apparent warmth of her smile. "Alfonso, my dear," she exclaimed, with a voice modulated by years of refined education, extending her gloved hands to him. You have changed so much since our last meeting. Mourning suits you in a very distinguished manner." Alfonso received her, hands with the courtesy his education required, but Catalina, who observed discreetly while arranging flowers in a nearby vase, could notice the tension that seized his shoulders and the studied formality of his smile. "Constanza, welcome to my home. I hope the journey was not too fatiguing." During dinner served in the main hall with all the magnificence the occasion required, Catalina performed her duties with impeccable efficiency that concealed the turmoil of her heart. Each time she approached the table to serve or remove plates, she could feel Constanza's eyes following her movements, with an attention that went beyond normal supervision of a noble lady over the service. "You have very interesting servants," commented Constanza with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "That young woman in particular seems quite distinguished to be a simple maid. Where did you get her?" The question floated in the air like a drop of poison mixed with honey, and Catalina felt how tension thickened in the salon. Alfonso maintained his composure, but she could perceive the effort it cost him to maintain neutrality in his expression. "Catalina is an efficient and discreet employee. Her service has been satisfactory since her arrival." But Constanza was not a woman easily satisfied with evasive answers. Her blue eyes fixed on Catalina with an intensity that seemed to want to penetrate to her most intimate thoughts. "Come closer, girl," she ordered, with an authority that admitted no disobedience. "I want to see you better." Catalina approached with her head slightly inclined, maintaining the respectful posture she had learned to adopt before nobility. But when Constanza took her chin with her gloved fingers and raised her face to examine her under the light of the candelabras she could see in those blue eyes, a suspicion that chilled her to the bone. "You have very refined features to be of humble origin," murmured Constanza with false sweetness. "And your manners. There is something about you that doesn't match your supposed condition." It was a declaration of war wrapped in silk and all. The people present in the salon could feel the tension that was established between the two women. Alfonso shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but remained silent, trapped between the courtesy due to his betrothed and the protective instinct that Catalina awakened in him. That night, while Catalina helped Constanza prepare for rest, the noblewoman turned to her with a smile that was pure threat disguised as amiability. "I hope you understand what your place is in this house, dear girl. Dreams above one's own condition usually end in very unpleasant nightmares. Could love survive the arrival of a rival who possessed not only beauty and education, but also the backing of social conventions and family commitments?" The campaign of destruction. The days that followed Constanza's arrival passed like a complex dance, where each movement had been choreographed by the implacable rules of aristocratic society. The Mendoza mansion transformed into a scenario where a theatrical piece was performed in which everyone knew their roles, but where true emotions had to remain hidden behind masks of courtesy and convenience. Constanza unfolded a calculated charm that was impossible to ignore. She organized musical soirees where her soprano voice filled the salons with nostalgic melodies, supervised the redecoration of various rooms with exquisite taste that spoke of years of aesthetic education, and demonstrated possessing a sharp intelligence for conversation topics that interested Alfonso, art, literature, and philosophy. But under this perfect surface, a much more sinister game was developing, of which only Catalina was fully conscious. Constanza had begun a subtle but systematic campaign to undermine her position in the house, employing strategies that were too refined to be detected by others, but sufficiently effective to make Catalina's life progressively more difficult. The other servants, influenced by apparently innocent comments from the distinguished guest, began to look at Catalina with a distrust that had not existed before. Rumors spread about her presumptuous behavior and her tendency to forget her place. The most unpleasant jobs began to be assigned specifically to her, and the small errors that any employee could make were magnified until they became serious faults. "That girl has airs of grandeur that don't correspond to her," murmured Constanza to Doña Mercedes during one of their evening conversations. "I've noticed how she looks at the Count, how she lingers unnecessarily when she's in his presence. A maid with such pretensions can become a serious problem for the harmony of the home. The campaign reached its climax during a rainy afternoon, when Constanza orchestrated what seemed to be an accident. She had strategically placed a Chinese porcelain vase on the edge of a table in the main salon in such a way that any sudden movement would make it fall. When Catalina entered to clean the room, she stumbled slightly on a carpet that had been subtly displaced from its usual position. The crash of the vase shattering resonated throughout the house like a death knell. It was a valuable piece part of a set that had belonged to the Mendoza family for generations, and its destruction represented not only an economic loss, but also a sacrilege to family memory. "My God!" exclaimed Constanza, appearing in the salon as if she had been summoned by the noise. "What happened here?" Catalina contemplated the fragments scattered across the marble floor with an expression of genuine horror. She knew it had not been completely an accident, but also understood that any explanation she offered would sound like a desperate excuse. "It was an accident, miss," she murmured, kneeling to begin collecting the pieces with hands that trembled slightly. "I didn't see the vase when I entered an accident." Constanza's voice distilled theatrical incredulity. "This vase has been on that table for decades, without anyone ever touching it. Only inexcusable negligence or something worse could explain what happened." It was at that moment that Alfonso appeared in the salon doorway, attracted by the commotion. His gaze swept the scene, the porcelain fragments, Catalina kneeling among the pieces, and Constanza standing with a perfectly calibrated expression of indignation. "What happened?" he asked with a calmness that concealed the tension Catalina could perceive in his voice. "Your maid destroyed your great-grandmother's Ming vase," responded Constanza, with a sigh of studied regret. "I fear negligence has reached unacceptable proportions." Alfonso looked at Catalina, and in his eyes she could read a silent question. She knew he understood that something more had occurred, that the circumstances were not as simple as they seemed, but she also knew he was trapped between his protective instinct for her and the social expectations that surrounded him. "Accidents happen," he said finally with careful neutrality. "The vase can be replaced." Alfonso's intervention, however subtle, did not go unnoticed by Constanza. In those few words, she had read an implicit defense that confirmed her darkest suspicions about the nature of the relationship between the Count and his employee. That night, while Catalina remained awake in her small room, she could hear the raised voices coming from the main wing of the mansion. She could not distinguish the exact words, but the tone of the discussion between Alfonso and Constanza was unmistakable. The war had officially begun, and Catalina knew she found herself at the center of a battle that could destroy not only her own life, but also the happiness of the man she loved. Could love survive the calculated attacks of one who possessed both the weapons of beauty and those of social power? The Great Humiliation. The Great Autumn Party at the Mendoza mansion was an event that had been prepared for weeks with the meticulousness of a military operation. The gardens had been decorated with garlands of late flowers and lanterns that created a magical atmosphere when night fell. The main salon had been transformed into a setting worthy of royalty, with Belgian lace tablecloths, silver dinnerware that reflected the light of hundreds of candles and floral arrangements that perfumed the air with fragrances of rose and jasmine. The cream of Valladolid's aristocracy had responded to the invitation, dukes and marquises with their bejeweled wives, young counts, seeking advantageous matrimonial alliances, and ladies of high society who competed discreetly to display the most exquisite dresses and the most dazzling jewels. Catalina, dressed in the impeccable uniform that corresponded to her position of servitude, moved among the guests with the silent grace of one who had learned to be invisible while fulfilling her function. She served glasses of French champagne, offered trays of culinary delicacies, and always maintained the neutral expression expected of someone of her condition. Constanza had chosen for the occasion an emerald green satin dress that enhanced the perfection of her figure and made her blue eyes shine like sapphires under the light of the candelabras. The jewels that adorned her neck and wrists spoke of considerable fortune, but it was her behavior that truly captured attention. She moved through the salon like a queen in her palace, dispensing calculated smiles and ingenious conversations that consolidated her position as the future Countess of Mendoza. "My dear Constanza," commented the Duchess of Alba, a mature woman whose influence in social circles was legendary, "Alfonso made an excellent choice. You form a perfect couple, both in beauty and lineage." "You are very kind, Duchess," responded Constanza with perfectly studied modesty. "Alfonso is an exceptional man, although I must confess he manages his household with a liberality that sometimes surprises me." The observation was made with a sweet smile, but the ladies present immediately caught the subtext. Their gazes instinctively directed toward Catalina, who at that moment was passing nearby, offering canapés to a group of gentlemen. "What do you mean, dear?" inquired the Marchioness of Santillana, with that avid curiosity that characterizes those who live off social gossip. "Oh, it's nothing significant," continued Constanza with false reluctance. "I simply noticed that certain members of the service allow themselves liberties that in other aristocratic homes would not be tolerated. I suppose it's Alfonso's generous heart that permits such familiarities." The poison distilled slowly, drop by drop into the ears of society's most influential ladies. Catalina, although she could not hear the exact words, felt the weight of gazes that fixed on her like pins and perceived the tension that spread through the salon like an oil stain. The humiliation reached its climax when the Marquis of Villena, a man known for his social cruelty and viperine tongue, decided to convert his observations into public spectacle. "Tell me, miss," he called to Catalina with a voice that cut through conversations like a knife, "is it true what is rumored about your close relationship with our host?" The silence that followed was deafening. All conversations ceased, all gazes directed toward Catalina, and in that attention there was not benevolent curiosity, but the cruel hunger of social predators who had detected vulnerable prey. Catalina felt how blush ignited her cheeks, but maintained her composure with a dignity that would have been admirable in any other circumstance. "I don't understand what you're referring to, Lord Marquis," she responded with a clear and firm voice. "My relationship with the Count is that which corresponds between an employer and his employee." "How interesting," exclaimed the Marquis with a cruel smile, "because according to what is commented, certain servants in this house have completely forgotten their place in the natural order of things." The laughter that followed was like knives cutting through the air, and in each one there was a contempt that made Catalina feel as if she had been stripped of all human dignity. She instinctively sought Alfonso's gaze, who remained near the fireplace, with an expression of marmoreal rigidity, but in his eyes she found something that devastated her, more than all the mockery, a silent impotence that spoke of his inability to defend her without compromising his own social position. Rumors are usually cruel and unfounded. Alfonso finally intervened with a controlled voice that only Catalina could recognize as containing a barely repressed fury. "My servants fulfill their functions with efficiency and discretion." But the defense, however correct, came too late. The damage was already done, and Catalina's humiliation had become the night's entertainment for a society that fed on others' misfortune. Catalina withdrew from the salon with her head held high, but when she reached the solitude of a secluded corridor, the tears she had contained with such effort began to slide down her cheeks like drops of wounded dignity. Could love survive when it became a motive for public scorn and social humiliation? The desperate defense. The echoes of the previous night's humiliation still resonated in the mansion corridors like ghosts of cruel words that refused to fade. Catalina had spent a sleepless night alternating between indignation at the treatment received and anguish at the impossible position she had placed Alfonso in. She knew that each disdainful look, each cutting comment directed at her, was also a stab directed at the heart of the man she loved. The morning passed in a tense silence that seemed to presage a storm. The servants avoided looking at her directly, as if humiliation were contagious, and Constanza walked through the house with a poorly disguised satisfaction that shone in her blue eyes like the triumph of a won battle. The decisive moment came, During lunch, when a select group of guests who had remained as hosts after the party gathered in the smaller salon for an intimate meal, the Marquis of Villena, encouraged by the success of his previous night's cruelty, decided to continue his attack with a viciousness that revealed the depth of his natural malice. "My dear Alfonso," he commented while tasting the wine with exaggerated affectation, "I must congratulate you on the originality of your servants. It's refreshing to find employees who feel so comfortable in the presence of nobility. Although, I must confess, in my house I maintain somewhat more traditional standards regarding appropriate behavior." Catalina, who was serving discreetly in a corner of the salon, felt how each word was a slap directed not only at her, but also at Alfonso. She could see how the muscles of his jaw tensed, how his hands slowly closed into fists on the polished mahogany table. "The servants of my house fulfill their functions with the efficiency I require," responded Alfonso, with a coldness that would have frozen water. "I see no reason to alter methods that have proven satisfactory." But the Marquis, intoxicated by his own cruelty, was not satisfied with this moderate response. "Ah, but my dear Count, I speak not only of efficiency but of decency, of respect for the hierarchies that God himself established. When certain elements are allowed to forget their natural place, the result can be very unpleasant for all involved." His eyes directed toward Catalina with such evident malice that several guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The young woman maintained her composure, but Alfonso could see the almost imperceptible tremor of her hands and the pallor that had invaded her face. "Especially," continued the Marquis with a venomous smile, "when it comes to young girls who might misinterpret the natural kindness of their employers as something more significant than it really is." It was at that moment that something broke inside Alfonso de Mendoza. Years of aristocratic education, of perfected emotional control, of obedience to social conventions, vanished like smoke before the primordial need to protect the woman he loved. He rose with a deliberate slowness that made the silence thicken in the salon like morning mist. His imposing stature and the natural authority that emanated from his presence completely transformed the room's atmosphere. "Marquis," his voice had the coldness of tempered steel, "I believe you have gravely misinterpreted the nature of my hospitality, and more seriously still, you have insulted a person under my protection in a manner I cannot and will not tolerate." The change was so dramatic that the guests remained motionless, like statues surprised by an unexpected revelation. Constanza visibly paled, understanding that the situation had completely escaped her control. "Alfonso, dear," she tried to intervene with a voice that intended to be conciliatory. "Catalina Morales," continued Alfonso, turning to her with an expression that combined tenderness and determination, "possesses more genuine nobility in her heart than many present at this table in their entire being. Her character, her integrity, and her humanity place her far above those who dare to judge her from the moral misery of their own prejudices." The silence that followed was absolute. Catalina felt how her heart stopped for a moment, overwhelmed by Alfonso's courage in exposing himself this way before all of high society. She knew these words would have devastating consequences for him, but also that they represented the most public and risky declaration of love a man of his position could make. "Alfonso," exclaimed Constanza, with a voice that trembled with indignation and panic. "Do you realize what you're saying, the consequences of your words?" Alfonso turned to her with a calmness that was more terrifying than any display of anger. "I realize perfectly, Constanza. I realize I have remained silent too long while despicable people humiliated someone who is worth more than all of us together. I realize I have put social conventions before justice and honor, and I realize this ends now." The Marquis of Villena had completely lost his arrogant composure and seemed to have shrunk in his chair like a cornered animal. "Marquis," Alfonso's voice acquired a tone that admitted no reply, "I suggest you leave my house immediately, and I assure you that any future comment about Miss Morales will be considered a personal offense that will demand satisfaction." It was a declaration of social war, an open challenge to the conventions that had governed their world for centuries. Alfonso had just sacrificed his position, his reputation, and his future to defend the honor of a woman who, according to all the rules of his society, had no right to such defense. Catalina looked at him with eyes that shone with tears of gratitude, love and terror at the consequences of his courage. Could love justify the destruction of an entire social world, or would the forces of convention ultimately defeat even the most valiant heart, their fire and social pressure? The days that followed the confrontation in the salon were like the prelude to a storm brewing on the horizon, where each passing hour increased the electric tension in the air until it became almost unbearable. News of Alfonso's public challenge to social convention spread through Valladolid's aristocracy like wildfire, fueled by the scandalized whispers of those who had been witnesses to the event. The consequences were not long in manifesting. The first to act were the merchants and suppliers who had maintained commercial relations with the Mendoza family for generations. Letters of apology arrived each morning, explaining with carefully crafted phrases why they could not continue offering their services to the house. Bankers sent formal communications suggesting the review of certain loans and investments. Aristocratic society had decided to apply the most effective punishment it knew: social and economic isolation. Constanza paced through the mansion like contained fury, alternating between attacks of hysterical crying and outbursts of anger that revealed the magnitude of her public humiliation. Her matrimonial engagement, which had been the envy of all young ladies of her circle, had become a motive for scorn and pity. "You've destroyed everything," she screamed at Alfonso during a confrontation that resonated throughout the house. "My reputation, my future, the alliance between our families, all for an insignificant maid who isn't even worthy of cleaning your shoes." Alfonso looked at her with a coldness that had replaced any vestige of affection or consideration he might have felt for her in the past. "The only thing I've destroyed, Constanza, are the illusions about a life built on lies and appearances. If your reputation depends on humiliating the defenseless, and your happiness is based on cruelty toward those who cannot defend themselves, then indeed we have no future together." Catalina observed from the shadows how her presence in the house had become the epicenter of a hurricane that threatened to destroy everything Alfonso had built over years. The other servants treated her with a mixture of reverential fear and poorly disguised resentment, as if she were simultaneously a saint and a curse that had fallen upon the mansion. The nights had become especially difficult. Alfonso spent hours in his study receiving letters that brought increasingly disheartening news about his social and financial situation. Banks began pressuring for payment of debts that had previously been renewed automatically. Invitations to social events ceased completely. Even the oldest servants of the house whispered about the possibility of seeking employment elsewhere, before the mansion was forced to reduce its staff. One particularly stormy night, with rain lashing the windows like tears from heaven, Catalina found Alfonso in the library, surrounded by financial documents and lawyers' letters. His face showed a fatigue that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was the exhaustion of a man who had bet everything on a single card and was beginning to understand the magnitude of his loss. "Do you regret it?" she asked, in a voice that was barely a whisper, but which cut through the library's silence like a confession torn from the soul. Alfonso raised his eyes from the papers and looked at her with eyes that had lost some of their usual brightness, but which preserved an iron determination she recognized as the immutable essence of his character. "I regret many things, Catalina. I regret taking so long to defend you. I regret allowing them to humiliate you in my own house. I regret putting social conventions before honor for so long." He rose from his chair and approached her with steps that seemed to carry the weight of all the difficult decisions he had made in his life. "But I don't regret loving you. I don't regret having said publicly what my heart feels, and I don't regret having chosen truth over convenience." His hands found hers, and in that contact there was a promise that transcended the adverse circumstances surrounding them. "But the price," murmured Catalina with tears that reflected the golden light of the candles. "The price you're paying for me is too high. Your position, your fortune, your place in the world." "My place in the world," Alfonso interrupted her. With a conviction that surprised her with its intensity, is wherever you are. My true fortune does not reside in banks or properties, but in the wealth of having your love. And my most honorable position is not that granted by a noble title, but that of being the man you chose to love despite all adversities. In that declaration, there was a conscious renunciation of everything that had defined his identity for 32 years, but there was also a liberation that transfigured him before Catalina's eyes. However, she knew that love, however pure, could not feed the servants, pay debts, or restore a destroyed reputation. The outside world continued pressing, and the forces they had unleashed threatened to drag them both into an abyss of unpredictable consequences. Could the truest love resist the implacable pressure of a society that did not forgive those who challenged its most sacred rules? The final trap, winter, arrived early at the Mendoza mansion, bringing with it icy winds that seemed to infiltrate the cold from outside to the very heart of the house. The gardens that during autumn had been a refuge of nostalgic beauty now presented themselves naked and somber, like a reflection of the emotional state of those who dwelt between these increasingly silent walls. The financial situation had deteriorated with alarming speed. 3 of the oldest servants had requested their letters of recommendation, explaining with tears in their eyes that they could not afford to remain in a house whose future had become so uncertain. Local suppliers had begun demanding immediate payments, and rumors about bank seizures circulated through the village like dry leaves dragged by the wind. Constanza, far from abandoning the mansion, as everyone expected, after the public humiliation, had adopted a different strategy. She had installed herself in her quarters like a queen in exile, weaving a web of intrigues that reached to the most influential social circles of Madrid. Her letters arrived and departed daily, carrying and bringing information she used as weapons in a silent but devastatingly effective war. The situation can be resolved easily, she had told Alfonso during one of their evening confrontations. A public apology, the immediate dismissal of that maid, and our marriage celebrated before Christmas. Scandals are quickly forgotten when replaced by stories of reconciliation and romance. But Alfonso had received her proposals with stony silence that spoke more eloquently than any verbal refusal. The final trap was gestated during preparations for the Feast of St. Andrew, a traditional celebration that the Mendoza family had organized for generations for their employees and the inhabitants of the nearby village. Despite the economic difficulties, Alfonso had insisted on maintaining the tradition, considering it a moral obligation toward those who had served his family faithfully. The jewel that disappeared was an extraordinary piece, a white gold brooch set with diamonds that had belonged to Alfonso's mother, a family relic whose sentimental value exceeded even its considerable material price. Constanza had displayed it, during dinner commenting on its beauty with admiration that seemed genuine. The disappearance was discovered the following morning when Constanza appeared at breakfast with an expression of perfectly calibrated anguish. "Alfonso, something terrible has happened," she exclaimed, with a voice that trembled with contained emotion. "Your mother's brooch, it's disappeared from my dressing table." The search was organized immediately. Every room was meticulously reviewed, every corner explored with the desperation of one seeking something irreplaceable. The servants were interrogated one by one, their belongings examined with a forced courtesy that could not disguise the humiliating nature of the process. It was Doña Mercedes who found the brooch. Dear God, her cry resonated from Catalina's room like the lament of a Greek tragedy. "It's here, the brooch is here." The small room immediately filled with people, Alfonso with his face contracted by incredulity, Constanza with an expression of shock that barely managed to conceal her satisfaction, and the remaining servants forming a semicircle of mute but eloquent witnesses. The brooch lay partially hidden under Catalina's mattress, placed in such a way that it seemed to have been hastily hidden by inexpert hands. The evidence was so perfect it was almost grotesque in its obviousness. "This is impossible," murmured Catalina with a voice that surprise had made hoarse. "I would never touch something that doesn't belong to me. Someone put this here." Her eyes sought Alfonso's with a desperation that would have moved stones, but he remained motionless, as if paralyzed by the magnitude of what he was witnessing. In his silence, Catalina read not distrust, but a terrible understanding of the perfection of the trap they had set. "What a grave accusation!" exclaimed Constanza, with indignation that sounded rehearsed. "You insinuate that someone in this honorable house would have conspired to incriminate you. What reason would we have for such wickedness?" The servants looked at Catalina with expressions that oscillated between pity and contempt. Some remembered the rumors about her airs of grandeur, others thought of the economic difficulties the house was going through, and all saw in the situation a convenient explanation for the problems that had tormented the mansion since her arrival. "Alfonso." Constanza's voice acquired a tone of authority she had never employed before. "I understand you feel certain affection for this young woman, but the evidence is incontrovertible. The honor of your family, the trust of your employees, the reputation of your house, everything depends on how you handle this situation." The silence that followed was so dense it seemed to have physical weight. Alfonso looked at the brooch as if it were a poisonous serpent, perfectly understanding the implications of each possible decision. Defending Catalina would mean defying evidence that everyone had witnessed. Condemning her would mean betraying not only his love, but also his deep conviction about her innocence. "I want everyone to leave this room," he said finally with a voice that sounded strangely hollow. "I need time to consider the situation." When they were alone, Catalina and Alfonso looked at each other across an abyss of incomprehension and pain that seemed unbridgeable. Could love survive when enemy forces had managed to create a situation where any action seemed a betrayal of one's own principles? The decision of the heart. Dawn arrived at the mansion wrapped in a thick mist that transformed the familiar landscape into something strange and ghostly. Catalina had spent the longest night of her life sitting by the window of her small room, contemplating how the first lights of dawn struggled to penetrate the haze that seemed to have enveloped not only the gardens, but also her heart. The decision had matured in her soul during those hours of insomnia like a bitter flower that blooms in the deepest darkness. She knew she could not remain in the mansion. Her presence had become a curse that threatened to destroy everything Alfonso had built. During his life, true love, she had understood with painful clarity, sometimes requires the greatest sacrifice, renouncing one's own happiness to preserve that of the beloved. She packed her few possessions in the same worn leather suitcase with which she had arrived months ago. It was pathetic how little she had accumulated during her stay. Some simple dresses, the book of poems that Alfonso had discreetly given her weeks before, and letters from her family that represented the only link to the life she had left behind. The final encounter took place in the library, that sanctuary of knowledge and memories, where they had shared so many moments of spiritual intimacy. Alfonso awaited her standing by the windows, contemplating the gardens submerged in morning mist. His silhouette was outlined against the greyish light, with a melancholic elegance that made Catalina's heart contract with pain. "I knew you would come to say goodbye," he murmured without turning, as if he had intuited her presence before she entered the room. "I've been waiting for you since dawn." "I must leave, Alfonso." Her use of his first name without titles or formalities sounded like a caress and a farewell at the same time. "My presence in this house has become poison for everything you love and value." Alfonso turned slowly, and in his face Catalina could read a resignation that spoke of lost battles and dreams sacrificed on the altar of implacable reality. "And if I told you that I don't care about losing everything else as long as I don't lose you?" The words floated between them like petals of a withering rose, beautiful but condemned to wilt. Catalina felt how the tears she had contained throughout the night began to slide down her cheeks like drops of infinite sorrow. "And I would tell you that true love cannot be built on the ruins of the beloved's life. I cannot be happy knowing that my happiness feeds on your social, economic, and family destruction." Alfonso approached her with steps that seemed to carry the weight of all the painful decisions he had made in his life. His hands found Catalina's face, drying her tears, with a tenderness that contrasted with the desperation in his eyes. "Then let's go together," he murmured, with an intensity that revealed he had considered this possibility during the hours of insomnia. "We abandon all this, the mansion, the title, social obligations. We can start a new life somewhere where no one knows our past. The proposal contained all the desperate romanticism of a drowning man clutching any lifeline. But Catalina, with the premature wisdom of one who had known poverty and the real limitations of life, understood the practical implications of such a decision, and live on how you were educated to be an aristocrat, not a common worker. And I could not live with the guilt of having been the cause of your complete ruin. Her hands rose to cover his, and in that contact there was an intimacy that transcended the physical to become a communion of souls. I want you always to remember that what we feel is real and true, that in this world of appearances and conveniences we found something genuine and pure. No one can ever take that from us, even if life separates us physically. Alfonso drew her to him with a desperation that spoke of a man preparing to lose the most valuable thing in his existence. Their lips met in a kiss that was simultaneously a declaration of eternal love and final farewell, a kiss that contained all the passion they had not been able to express freely, and all the sorrow of knowing it was the last. "I love you," he murmured against her lips, using for the first time the intimate address that social conventions had forbidden them. "I will love you until the last day of my life and beyond, if possible." "And I love you," she responded with a voice broken by emotion. "I love you enough to set you free so you can rebuild your life without the burden of my presence." They separated slowly, like two magnets fighting against an invisible force that attracted them. Alfonso took her hands in his and kissed them with a reverence that spoke of religious adoration. "If circumstances ever change, if the world ever becomes more understanding, if destiny wants us to meet again, it will find a way," completed Catalina. "But now I must go before my courage completely vanishes." The final farewell was consummated in silence, with a look that contained all the words they could not speak, all the dreams they could not share, and all the hope they dared not cherish. Catalina left the mansion as she had arrived, under a fine rain that seemed to weep for the impossible loves of the world. But this time she carried with her the memory of a love that had defied all conventions and the certainty that some experiences transcend circumstances to become eternal truths of the human heart. Could such pure love ever find its way back, or was it destined to live only in the inviolable sanctuary of memory? The miraculous return. 6 months had passed since Catalina left the Mendoza mansion, 6 months during which time seemed to have stopped in those rooms that now resonated with the echo of memories and the absence of laughter that had once filled them with life. Alfonso had fallen into a deep melancholy that worried even the oldest servants who watched their master slowly become a shadow of himself. Constanza had departed for Madrid after a final devastating confrontation in which Alfonso had declared with a coldness that chilled the soul that he would rather die a bachelor than marry without love. The definitive breaking of the engagement had caused a scandal that spread throughout Spanish aristocracy, but Alfonso had received the consequences with an indifference that revealed how profoundly his perspective on life's priorities had changed. The mansion's gardens had begun to show signs of abandonment. The rosebush that Elena had planted by the lake continued to bloom, but weeds grew among the paths and the fountains had begun to fill with fallen leaves that no one bothered to remove. It was as if the place's beauty had decided to wither in solidarity with its owner's broken heart. Catalina, meanwhile, had found employment at a modest inn in a village 2 days' journey from Valladolid. It was humble but honest work that allowed her to support herself while trying to rebuild the fragments of her heart. The nights were the most difficult, when memories of Alfonso visited her with an intensity that left her breathless, reliving each conversation, each look, each moment of intimacy they had shared. It was the young village doctor, Dr. Sebastián Herrera, who brought her the news that would change the course of both their lives forever. "There's a man in Valladolid who is sick with sadness," he told her during one of his professional visits to the inn. "The doctors find no physical cause for his deterioration, but those who know him say he's slowly dying of sorrow. I thought you should know." Catalina's heart stopped for a moment, then began to beat with a violence that threatened to break her ribs. "Alfonso," she murmured, and in that name was all the terror and all the hope in the world. The Count of Mendoza has dismissed all his servants except the most indispensable. They say he spends days without eating, that he wanders through his mansion like a ghost. The rumors speak of a lost love that is slowly killing him. Catalina doesn't remember making the decision to return. She simply found herself packing her few possessions, saying goodbye to the kind family that had welcomed her at the inn, and undertaking the journey back to the mansion she had left 6 months ago with a broken heart but a clear conscience. The reunion occurred at dawn on a spring day that seemed to have been painted by a passionate artist. Catalina had arrived during the night and had waited in the gardens by Eleanor's rosebush until she saw Alfonso's familiar silhouette outlined against the library windows. When he saw her walking down the gravel path, he believed for a moment it was a vision, a hallucination created by his desperate mind. But when she approached close enough for him to see the tears that shone in her eyes like diamonds under the golden light of dawn, he knew that the miracle for which he had prayed during 6 interminable months had finally occurred. "I came back," murmured Catalina when she was close enough to touch his gaunt face. "I could not live knowing you were suffering because of me." Alfonso took her in his arms with a force that spoke of desperation and infinite gratitude, like a man embracing life after walking through the valley of death. "I thought I had lost you forever," he whispered against her hair. "I thought my punishment for taking so long to recognize my love would be to live the rest of my days with this emptiness in my soul." "You would never have lost me," she responded, with a conviction born from the depths of her being. "True love knows no distances or time. My heart never left you even though my body had to." They separated enough to look into each other's eyes, and in that gaze they found confirmation that their love had survived separation's social obstacles and all the forces that had conspired to separate them. "What will we do now?" asked Alfonso, and in his voice there was a vulnerability that contrasted with the natural authority that had always characterized his presence. "We will marry," responded Catalina, with a simplicity that contained all the wisdom of the world. "We will marry and face any consequence together. The love we found is too valuable to sacrifice again on the altar of social conventions." Alfonso looked at her with surprise and admiration. In those months of separation, Catalina had found a new strength, a determination that spoke of a woman who had discovered her own worth and had decided to fight for her right to happiness. "And the scandal, the social consequences, the loss of my position." "Let them talk," she responded with a smile that illuminated her face like the sun after a storm. "Let them murmur and be scandalized. We will build our happiness on more solid foundations than the approval of those who have never known true love." The kiss that sealed this declaration was different from all they had shared before. There was not in it the desperation of farewell, nor the guilt of forbidden love, but the pure celebration of two souls who had found their way back to each other. The happy ending. 3 weeks later, Alfonso de Mendoza and Catalina Morales were married in the small village chapel before a handful of witnesses that included the doctor who had reunited the lovers, some loyal servants who had remained with Alfonso during his darkest months, and an elderly woman from the village who declared she had not seen a more beautiful bride in 60 years of life. Constanza sent a letter from Madrid full of venom and predictions of disgrace, but Alfonso threw it into the fire without reading it completely. The past had lost its power over him, only the glorious present and the future he would build with the woman who had chosen to love him above all adversities existed. Aristocratic society reacted with expected indignation, but also with something unexpected, a secret respect for the courage of a man who had had the courage to follow his heart to the ultimate consequences. Some young nobles began to question their own arranged commitments, and more than one high society lady confessed privately that she envied the passion Alfonso had demonstrated for his plebeian wife. In the years that followed, the Mendoza mansion gradually transformed into something different from what it had been before. Without the weight of social expectations and the most rigid aristocratic obligations, it became a home in the true sense of the word, a place where love, laughter, and mutual understanding replaced pomp and ceremony. Alfonso discovered that Catalina possessed a natural intelligence and practical wisdom that helped him manage his affairs in a more efficient and humane manner. She learned to read and write, fluently developed a natural taste for literature and music, and became a hostess who, though not accepted by traditional high society, was adored by a growing circle of intellectuals, artists, and progressive thinkers. The love that had begun as a forbidden spark had become a fire that illuminated not only their own lives, but also those of everyone who had the fortune to witness what the courage to love without restrictions could achieve. And so, in a Spain, where class differences seemed like insurmountable walls, two brave souls demonstrated that true love knows no borders or limitations when it finds hearts willing to fight for it to the end.